Hello, I'm Sergeant First Class Calvin Witt. I'm an anatomy and physiology instructor at the AMED Center and School, Fort Sam Houston, Texas. In today's laboratory, we're going to look at the anatomy and physiology of the central nervous system. The central nervous system is described as being composed of the brain and the spinal cord. Any fiber which extends outside of that central nervous system is described as being part of the peripheral nervous system. Let's begin our discussion of the central nervous system by looking at some of the protective mechanisms available to protect the brain and spinal cord. In beginning our discussion of the protective coverings for the brain and the spinal cord, we will start with first the most obvious protective layer, that being the bones of the skull. Notice, if you will, the thickness of the skull in the regions of the head that would be most susceptible to sustaining a heavy blow. It is a very strong and protective covering. This bony framework continues along the spinal cord as part of the vertebral canal, and the bony tissues in the vertebral canal also form a very strong and sturdy housing for the central nervous system. Interior to the skull and this vertebral canal are layers of connective tissues, or protective types of tissues, that are referred to as the meninges. The singular term for the meninges, for one, is the meninx, M-E-N-I-N-X. The first meninx that we want to discuss as a continuation of the protective mechanisms for the central nervous system is the dura mater. The dura mater is a very tough connective tissue. The term dura mater, in fact, literally translates into tough mother, meaning it is a very tough tissue but cradles and protects the central nervous system. The fibers of the dura mater in the skull are entwined and connected very strongly to the endosteum, the connective tissue that lines the bone inside the cranial area. That dura mater extends down and around the spinal cord as well. You can see an extension of the dura mater that goes down between the two halves of the cerebrum. And though it is not a thick tissue, it is a very strong connective tissue. The next meninx that serves to protect the central nervous system is referred to as the arachnoid. The arachnoid is a very delicate tissue that will adhere to the undersurface of the dura mater by way of a slight film of fluid that's located in that area. The arachnoid will have fibers extending down from that region of the protection to the next meninx, which is the pia mater. The space between the arachnoid that adheres to the dura mater and the pia mater is referred to as the subarachnoid space. The subarachnoid space is a considerable volume that encloses the brain and spinal cord and has within it a fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. That cerebrospinal fluid is present to act as a liquid shock absorber to keep the brain from crashing against the side of the head in sudden or violent types of movements. Continuing inward in the protective devices for the central nervous system is another layer of connective tissue, or meninx, that's referred to as the pia mater. The term pia mater translates to tender mother. This is a very thin and delicate tissue that gives the shiny appearance to the surface of the brain and spinal cord. Let's continue our discussion of the central nervous system by now looking closer at the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the larger, superior portion of the brain. There are a number of terrain features or landmarks associated with the cerebrum that we need to become familiar with. We'll begin by looking at the ridges or little bumps that are seen on the surface of the cerebrum. These ridges are referred to as gyri. Gyrus is the singular of that term. Between the gyri are shallow grooves or furrows that can be seen, and these structures are referred to as sulci. There's still a deeper groove within the brain that appears to divide the cerebrum into two halves. This deeper groove is a fissure, and the large fissure that runs from anterior to posterior in the cerebrum is referred to as the longitudinal fissure. Though the brain appears to be divided into two complete halves, there is communication between the left and right half of the cerebrum. This communication is provided by a structure known as the corpus callosum. Let's look now at a little more detail about the lobes of the cerebrum. The lobes of the cerebrum are areas of the cerebrum that are identified according to the bones under which they lie. On the anterior aspect of the cerebrum is the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is the center for those activities that we call higher thought processes. Things such as logic, reasoning, emotions. The aspect of the cerebrum that is located beneath the parietal bone is referred to as the parietal lobe of the cerebrum. And though there are many, many activities that are governed by the parietal lobe, the primary activity that we associate with the parietal lobe is that of interpreting general sensations. Sensations such as heat and cold, touch, and pain. The posterior aspect of the cerebrum is referred to as the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe of the cerebrum has within it the vision centers. And the fourth lobe of the cerebrum, it's identified with the temporal bone, is the temporal lobe of the cerebrum. Temporal lobe is the site for receiving and interpreting special senses such as hearing and taste. Continuing our look at the brain, let's now look at another division which is located beneath the cerebrum and behind the brain stem. This region is referred to as the cerebellum. The cerebellum is also divided into two halves, and its primary function is to control or to provide motor coordination for all types of activities, including equilibrium. Underneath the cerebrum is a region of the brain that is known as the diencephalon. The diencephalon is comprised of two parts known as the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The thalamus is this region of the brain that would be located just below the corpus callosum and above the midbrain. The thalamus is the region of the brain that is responsible for receiving sensory information of all types that would be coming into the brain from outside of the body tissues themselves. Located below the thalamus is the region known as the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is responsible for receiving sensory information that would be coming in from the viscera. Now discussing the brain stem, moving downward into the lower aspect of the brain, there are two components of the brain stem. These are the pons and the medulla oblongata. The pons is the region of the brain that is responsible for relaying information between various components of the brain and between the brain and the spinal cord. The more inferior portion of the brain stem is referred to as the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata provides a communication between the brain and the spinal cord, and located within the medulla oblongata are those vital control centers for heart rate and respiration activities. Even though the cranial nerves are part of the peripheral nervous system, there are two of the cranial nerves which have an influence on the appearance of the brain itself. On the anterior and inferior surface of the cerebrum are two grooves that are referred to as the olfactory tract. The olfactory tract has within it the olfactory nerve, which is responsible for carrying the sense of smell to the brain. The next major cranial nerve is the optic nerve. The optic nerve carries vision impulses from the eyes. They cross at a point known as the optic chiasm. The brain communicates with the rest of the body by way of cranial and spinal nerves. The spinal nerves arise from the spinal cord. The spinal cord runs from the foramen magnum at the base of the skull to approximately the first or second lumbar vertebrae. Fibers continue below the first and second lumbar vertebrae, but it no longer looks like a cord, but rather like a horse's tail. This region is known as the cauda equina. The spinal cord is a cylindrical mass of nerves that communicate with the brain. The interior region of the spinal cord is comprised of gray matter, which is unmyelinated nerve fibers, and the outer portion of the spinal cord is white matter. This is contrasted to the arrangement of the gray and white matter in the brain, in that the brain has the gray matter on the exterior surface, or the cortex of the brain, and the white matter is located internally inside the brain. This concludes today's laboratory on the anatomy and physiology of the central nervous system.